peak of a cloud resembling a clump of extremely white light. The King of Dhamma, omniscient Nosandrika, please come here together with your sons. In the sky, before me on the lion throne lotus moon, my perfect pure Guru smiles with delight. Supreme field of merit, on my mind of faith, please abide for 100 eons to spread the teaching. Your holy mind has the intelligence that understands the full extent of objects to be known. Your holy speech, with its excellent explanations, is a hidden ornament for those of good fortune. Your holy body is radiant and beautiful with glory renowned. To you who are meaningful to see, hear, and remember, I prostrate. These include water, various flowers, fragrant incenses, light-scented waters, and so forth. Oceans of fire-like offerings, both actually arranged and mentally emanated, I offer to you the supreme field of merit. Whatever knowledge the body, speech, and mind, especially those opposite to the three vows that I have collected from beginning this time, I confess each and every one with fervent regret from my heart. You strove for much learning and practice in this regenerate age and made your freedoms and riches as meaningful. I abandon in the outwardly concerned Saviour who sincerely rejoices in your extensive deeds. Perfect, pure, holy Gurus, from the billowing clouds of wisdom and compassion who inspire the Dharma fire, please let fall a rain of profound and extensive Dharma upon the receptacle of those to be subdued, exactly as they need. May whatever virtue I have collected benefit the teachings and all transmigrating beings, and in particular may it cause the essence of perfect Guru Sandraika's teachings to shine forever. Sashi Kriti Shushe Metotam Riravichi Yekati Sanye Shinde Vidyahuadi Prabhunanda Shimachu Pashu. By the merits of having offered this mandala to Lamrim and his two sons, may I, my family members, and all sentient beings be able to live, practice, and actualize the teachings of the victorious one, Lord Sandraika, who had the morality of an eminently pure way of life, was courageous in the extensive conduct of the sons of the victorious ones, and accomplished the yoga of the two stages of supreme bliss and emptiness. Idam Guru Ratna Mandala Kambhirya Chayami. By the force of having fervently requested in this way, hollow beams of white light are emitted from the hearts of the perfect pure Father and sons, and combining into one into my palm. White nectar, the colour of milk, flows from the opening of the tube of white light, cleansing all my sicknesses, spirit harms, negative karmas, obscurations, and their imprints without exception. My body becomes as pure and clear as crystal. So turn to page 13, or the next page over, in the middle, the 5-line Sema verse, 3 times. Mikme se we tension generesi, Kime kempe wampo jambayan, Gupuma vishon se samveda, Kanchen kempe sunken sankapa, Lo santra pesha laso ade. Mikme se we tension generesi, Kime kempe wampo jambayan, Gupuma vishon se samveda, Kanchen kempe sunken sankapa, Lo santra pesha laso ade. Mikme se we tension generesi, Kime kempe wampo jambayan, Gupuma vishon se samveda, Kanchen kempe sunken sankapa, Lo santra pesha laso ade.
Sangye Chetan Soje Chonramba Chanchu Bade Dani Kyasushi Dagi Shushin Gipe Sonam Drola Benche Sangye Dropa Sangye Chetan Soje Chonramba Chanchu Bade Dani Kyasushi Dagi Shushin Gipe Sonam Drola Benche Sangye Dropa Sangye Chonan Soji Chonamba Chanchu Bade Dani Kyasuchi Dagi Shushin Gipe Sonagi Drola Benche Sangye Dropa 강기 도전이 zon에 따와 던지 방비체 담비 좀 된지 거든 될라 창세로 Good morning. 그래서 참더디 한다 제수이랑 체기 제수이랑 양라티 그래서 이 바보 상부주비기 비기 상주 양라 준비 아니 시리에션도 마 제로지 소 대기 나한테 제수이랑 코트레샤스라
We've been looking at the preparatory practices for the beginning of the meditation session, and such part of it is a practice that is called the 7 limbs of practice. Now, within the 7 limbs of worship, the 7 limbs of practice, we've covered a few of them. Today, we're going to pick up from the limb of rejoicing. Now, the way that Lama Tsongkhapa, the author of the text that we're studying at the moment, the middling Lamrim, the way that Lama Tsongkhapa teaches that is through drawing from Samantabhadra's King of Prayer. So he looks at the beginning of Samantabhadra's King of Prayer, which contains a practice of the 7 limbs of worship. So Lama Tsongkhapa cites a line or two from that text, and then he explains the way to put it into practice.
Lama Tsongkhapa song torwa tenji namala ya beba chung labchen chok dupa gel jesu yaran chok is denji song yares.
And as Lama Tsongkhapa refers to rejoicing, he says that it is a supreme practice of rejoicing for just with a little bit of effort, you're able to gather a great amount of accumulations.
Danganzolaya diang ben jesu yaran che thi kyaranzolaya kale mission ngan kale tipe unne thane ge pigi ge chadang chonglong meba ji tamji laya jesu yaran che tu ya gi sanjam jil lebaina ngesam kana kansam jil ya male pardu jesu yaran che di same thing ro
Geshe finds the limb of rejoicing to be a little bit hard. He doesn't know how it works for you guys, but it's not easy at all. It might seem to be easy, but it's not like that, Geshe feels, because in rejoicing in the virtues of others, you want to do that without any sense of partiality, without the partiality of having attachment to some and aversion to others. To have that sense of rejoicing that is really coming from the bottom of your heart, in which kind of from the bottom of your heart, you rejoice in the good deeds of others, is something that is quite hard to do.
Salaya, Drayagi, and Gunso Kandasagaya Vainaya, and tell Yata, same thing, the Yagura, Samsongi, Logic to Vaina, Tini, Labchin Shujeres, Ra.
So then looking at our ability to do it, we rejoice in the virtue of training in virtue and positivity. Those that contribute to the state of enlightenment or the state of liberation, whatever might be the collection of causes that lead to those states, to sentient beings' liberation, to sentient beings' enlightenment, from the bottom of our heart, we think, that's so good, that's excellent. That is rejoicing in virtue.
Lon Tunsajiki, Dugjaji Chebanaya, Koyabure Sam there. And Suzuki, Tao Mintun Sajadan, and Chiksosu Magasajiki, one Tanigi, Tanda Dembi, Chawas Chebanaya, and Telia, and Sik Shambaji Nebi Gavchin, Marin Dondo Chide Mato, Jesu Yaranche, Pekabure dos, Ra.
And the point here is to do it without any sense of partiality. And yet, when we look at our mind, at the way that our mind works, that those people that we like, those that we agree with, they are compatible with us. Even when they behave in a way that is negative, we find reasons for saying that it's okay. They're still good. And there are those that we dislike. And when they act in a positive way, we find ways of playing it down. We say that, yeah, that was all right, but, and then we add something else in order to play it down.
Beba chungu chiki labu chin so labu chi sagre soya di ta nyamne kana kanzam chiki ya suen dingi chiki duji ond beba chungu saya di dindi sungu mendos ra pena ngan samundo teba chimbu ki chu chigi si lagora ngonni ki teba chimbu chu chigi di tambo ani pena ninji ki 아니 샘기 아니 샘기기 전주생 동바송 아니 제소 파신 중다 라원디 다 되니 심제 탐질 미기 인지다 참바생인디 여여버로 차그러 왔어 다 딘지지 토니 아니 다 제수여란 제사기 내려야 rum바망부 요레스 소소리 페나 아니 또번 토알아야 아니 제수여란 제바나 디츠게 손을 라보치 사고 여바다 아니 랑다 냠발이야 아니 지 제수이란 제바나 아니 대단 된송 아니 지 랑 멤버질이야 제수이란 제바이나야 아니 델파비기 아니 게발라보치 사고야 딘디지 송고로 왔어.
So then when Lama Tsongkhapa in his text says that rejoicing in virtue is a way of accumulating a very powerful accumulation using very little effort, Geshe reckons that it refers to those that have reached a high level in their practice. Those that have reached a high level of practice in which they've reduced the partiality of anger and attachment to the point in which they've rid themselves of the sense of biasing without being biased by anger and attachment, and can rejoice sincerely in the virtues of others. They can, with very little effort, accumulate a very powerful wave of accumulations. So how does it work? Well, we call ourselves practitioners of the Mahayana Dhamma, right? So then in terms of practicing the Mahayana Dhamma, we begin with generating compassion for sentient beings. Then we go on and develop bodhicitta, the mind of enlightenment. Then we take up the bodhisattva vow. And on that basis, we practice the 6 perfections, such as generosity. And in whatever way we can, we take up those trainings. And at some point, we also put into practice the training in rejoicing. And also different types of rejoicing, different ways of rejoicing. You can rejoice in those that are of higher level than you are. And when you rejoice in their good qualities, you accumulate also very, very powerful degrees of accumulations. Then you can rejoice in those who are equal to you. Commensurate with that, there is also accumulation that you gather. And then there are those who are doing less than you. And also in relation to that, there's a certain degree of accumulation that you get. So the different ways of rejoicing, and this is the way that those that are of expertise in the practice rejoice.
These are Tabachimbi Chuk, Tabachimbi Chuk, Yamling Zawadi, Ninji Dang, Chamba Chagioris, Ninji the Chamba, and Chanjuk Sem with Sembaina, the and Gavakar Chebaina, Chavakar Chebaina, and Solaboch Sayach, Jungiors, Ra. Di Mena, Shiza, and Chamba the Ninji singing tea. Zawa nin chik sem nangla ya chitsam ya matro na teni ming teba chimbi chu ta ni chik khar che na ya rangdyo khokchang ki somba na 디 첼 드루기메티 소사기메티 테좀레샤스 로 테좀레샤스
So that's what occurs when your practice begins with the development of compassion and loving kindness. This is the root of the Mahayana Dhamma, the practice of compassion and a sense of concern for others. And if that's what motivates you, compassion and a sense of concern for others, whatever you do contributes to a great and powerful accumulation of virtue. And without compassion, without that sense of love and concern to others, you will not even sense the scent of the Mahayana Dhamma. So you might be then saying that I am following the Mahayana Dhamma, I am practicing the Mahayana Dhamma, but if you do that with a sense of concern for yourself mainly, thinking about your own goals, your own purposes, and so forth, without extending loving concern and compassion to others, first off, is what you practice be a really genuine Mahayana Dhamma? Is that going to be considered to be a spiritual practice of the Dhamma? It's quite doubtful, isn't it?
데리다 베나간족이 잔죽 셈다 닌지다 잠바 잔죽 셈생 위어바이나 아니 축갑강 통바이네야 수수 축갑강 통바이네야 아니 셴든 로야치 라 태버치 쳬르 로야치 안 딘디 규레요라스다 로 간지 아니 잔죽 셈기 셈바이나 아니 뒤단 남바콘도 아니 룽아 이스음기 자와 가르쳐바이네야 아니 셴든 삼비기 콜론 딘디지 토네 아니 자와 간다질 슈바이네야 디 쳬르 로야치 태버치 쳬르 로야치 용구요레스라 다 디메나 안 태버치 쳬 drogo mares, drogo mares.
So then when we think about it, for example, when your practice is qualified, it is combined with bodhicitta, the mind of enlightenment, which is rooted in compassion. Even drinking a glass of water can become a practice of benefiting others. When you think of, I'm doing it for the sake of others, doing it with bodhicitta, the mind of enlightenment, whatever activity you take up, physical, verbal, mental activity, that activity becomes a practice of the Mahayana Dhamma. But without thinking of the welfare of others, without taking that to be your motivation, the welfare of others, whatever you put into practice does not become a practice of the Mahayana Dhamma.
Rachuzo nishitsabshi nang ta gosha gyabayana ta manshu di gyacha manshu di ni kuya tolaya tango ras. Tinza ni kuya di ni di ani chö namala ya shengyur yins kulung la dogres. Ni di kawkala ya ni gewala dogres kawkala ya ni me gewala dogres kawkala luma den dogres sondi di roya gi gige tso di kulung la ya ni maku kong kulung joras. Dela rale nganza ni maku kong 니지 당 참바 찬주 셈도 딘디지 콤체네 안지 아니 딱 딘디기 콘몬 딘디지 돈다 셴전 라보치지 조고 삼비기 삼로 딘디지 돈이 되니 딱지 셴전 드발이야 안지 랑 류데부지 메나 아니 셴전디 카츠 시스템만고 조그메만자 류 소약 체도 셴전 드비야기 양라 류 소약 체도 아니 니야무지 쿠고 삼바이나 아니 니디 게와게나기 아니 태바치미 비치우 촐이야 드로그레스 디 탁쳐버로 레도스라 딘자 당간서 소소소기 남조데 데비톤 로 상도도 인지미 준거지.
Even as far as getting some sleep. So looking at the passing of a day, 24 hours, and how much time we spend on sleep. Probably comparing to other activities throughout the day, if you try to assess it, how much, to what percentage are we asleep? Probably you would find that sleep is one of the activities that we're mostly engaged with within the passing of 24 hours. So sleep is regarded to be a changeable mental factor. So there are different types of mental factors in our consciousness. Sleep is one of them, and sleep is regarded as a changeable mental factor, which means that sometimes sleep can be virtuous, sometimes it could be non-virtuous, and at other times it could be neutral. So suppose that just before going to sleep, you generate a motivation that is concerned with the welfare of others, with an altruistic intention, motivated by compassion to others, by loving concern to others, and with that you go to sleep. Then sleep as a changeable mental factor becomes a virtuous mental factor. So even that then can contribute to being a practitioner of the Mahayana Dhamma. So for example, you would think that in order to be able to be effective, powerfully effective in my work for the sake of others, I need to make sure that my body gets the rest that it needs so that I will be able to continuously work for the sake of others. So when you then go to sleep with that motivation, thinking that you're doing that in order to get the rest that you need in order to continue to work for the sake of others, then even that is part of your practice of the Mahayana Dhamma, which means that you can develop skills in being smart, being intelligent in the way that you approach activities, even mundane activities, and even they can be used as practices of the Mahayana Dhamma.
나 dire penangazu ta nyamnu yoros ra ni ma khu ko gonda ni ma khu ko ji khamden test de samya test tang do cheni nyesan ya nyewaina ni ti gyobo shuch ra lamsa ni kuture ni kun khogri ya ji mulam thu de mayimba ji mulam jina ya mulam sambota ya ji ra Then you say because subolia mix and non-su sonanchi yungudas. The mena ni marco con some lot di chadamos, Yorta Kanjan, Samutan, and Nisan Zuana, Nisa the Namji Nisa Devodianchi, Madej. Then you dear Marco, Jerome Shuji, Paolo, and so Alo de Goya, and you cover really Malam True de Jodoch. And you sound the denation, Kalakadi. Tinti young does rather kanji.
So we know that based upon a personal experience, so we can try it out. Before we go to sleep, if we spend some time thinking through some positive points in our spiritual practice, we do our final recitations or our final meditation, make sure that our mind becomes positive prior to going to sleep, then when we go to sleep, we can quickly fall asleep and you don't experience disturbed dreams. You have good dreams, and when you wake up from your sleep, you feel rested. You feel that your body is restored. You feel rejuvenated. Whereas if you go to sleep with a mind that is disturbed by anger, with attachment and so forth, in that you still have that agitated or discursive state of mind that is affected by anger, attachment, and so forth. Even if your bedroom is really comfortable, even if the bed is really comfortable, you're still having this unrested sleep. You turn from one side to another, and even when you get up from bed, you feel that you didn't get the rest that you needed.
Then Devan Dungi, Dungam Mundingi Jimuni, and Sam Kuyang Chigueti, Samba Kuyang Shudi, and Champagne Samut Yavana, and Kuyang Chagores, Rana Ya Pengiore, Shana Ya Pengiore, Rajit Samula Penguenza, Kuyang Samlo, and Ninji Down, Chamba, Chanju something in the and the two giant Teresias, then Timji Yavana. And carry in Jisir and Chigana, carry Chigana, and Solabut Sadech. The mena and Saman Gardrich, the Yajanaba, the Resra.
So in that way, we combine our activities such as even going to sleep with having that esteem and trust in the Mahayana Dhamma. We have trust in the objects of refuge. We also recognize that all sentient beings are the same as us in wanting to be happy and not wanting to experience suffering and pain. We think that just like me, other sentient beings want to avoid unfortunate situations. So in that sense, we then develop attitudes that are beneficial to ourselves and beneficial to others. We think, may I be able to be of benefit to myself and to other sentient beings. We combine that with a compassionate attitude, with the mind of enlightenment. So whatever we do, whatever activity we take up, it becomes a very effective and powerful activity that contributes to a great accumulation of merit and wisdom.
Da kanji samujibigi tsigdi chokju gyawa konda sangi se tsigji di rangel nanda lagyo se di tsigdi so kharsun gor slaundi tsigdi ngusu tanda jesu yerang chesagi yul telya so ngach tengdo asra so ngati.
So we said that when Lama Tsongkhapa explains in his text the 7 limbs of worship, and here we're looking at the limb of rejoicing, it does that with referring to Samantabhadra's King of Prayer, which is a very common and popular practice that contains the 7 limbs. So let's look at the limb of rejoicing in Samantabhadra's text. Second.
Page 345.
So it says, I lift up my heart and rejoice in all positive potential of the Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, and in 10 directions, of solitary realizers, hearers still training, and those beyond, and all ordinary beings.
This one the Kansan Natan the Tudan, the Kanji Zu di and Chok Ju said that Namjing on the Chok they only Ju and the Tamji Chon Shubigi and Choji was said that Jebati and Chiglata, not Digolis, and Rangel Nientu in the Penata, Rangel Nientu, and the Papa de Mulova. And Dingach, that gave a country of Atelia, and it did pay attention it, and it Gawa community. What did is?
So we have here different beings that we rejoice in the virtues of each. We have Buddhas, Bodhisattvas in the 10 directions, solitary realizers and hearers, which means those which are Hinayana practitioners, those that are still training, those that have completed the trainings, and also all ordinary beings. Lama Tsongkhapa says in his text, let's find the text. He says in his text with respect to rejoicing. Rejoicing is set forth in the single stanza, the victors of the 10 directions. So this is the verse that we've just read through. As you recall the advantages of the 5 persons, virtue, you cultivate joy. So you think of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas of the 10 directions. Now, when we refer to the 10 directions, we have the 4 cardinal directions, the 4 intermediate directions, those above and those below, which means that we think of all Buddhas and Bodhisattvas residing everywhere, and we think of their good virtues, and we rejoice in that. Also, we rejoice in the virtues of others, those who are still training, those that have completed the training, ordinary beings. So however many number of beings there are, regardless of the classification, 5 types of beings, 6 types of beings, whatever might be the division, we think of all the virtues, and from the bottom of our heart, we develop a great appreciation of that, thinking that is excellent. That's the branch of rejoicing.
Yeah, that the that chile Jamanung Jimbana, the Kansangag mean down the Gonyo Buddha's pay, Chaldos, Inea, the 2 the Sobat the Mulo said, Judgment, Tinam Duolis, that purpose long the lam love cover ya chi any some my give cover ki lam love cover any kansa kind ti there loba secrets ra any di lam love chin tar chin sang give cover ya and mulu covers and delay choji jaw set and chiba yungu yores ra o di kanji di ni nan di bi and churching 탐제 logo and church kanchiba di pay gawa gombaina and sigji tenda di tinan duores.
So if you haven't done some study of the Dhamma before, those terms might be a little bit complicated. You might get, you might think that they're too technical, it's too complicated to understand what's happening here. We can summarize it into those people that are still training on the way to become Buddhas, and those that have already completed the trainings, they've attained the state of Buddhahood. So we think of all those people that are still training, have completed the training. We think of all the positive qualities and virtues they have generated. And when, from the bottom of our heart, we appreciate that, thinking this is excellent. This is what we do with rejoicing.
Pay attention and yuan tension or dindicilla jargo does. Mission ki yuan some to buy and mission di the mission di any Karsota yeto Tommy logic get towards mission yuan some to buy and mission can just some devina yuan yonaya masamba kyang chon te devina midday and it's Marab Tondeada, Manzeva Tondeada, and in Middelia, Senda Ring Ragi begins charters.
Which means, in short, that we turn our mind to thinking of the qualities, the benefits. And it works like that in general, in that when we, in our mind, when we consider the good qualities of others, we find them appealing. Whereas if our mind is tending to always find faults in others, when we look for faults in others, when we criticize others, our mind tends then to perceive others with that negative attitude, and we draw in our heart further and further away from those people. We develop a sense of distance between ourselves and others.
Susu tatsuk toni yungul do asra ta mission dan ganda chawai no magi ba jingura ta mete da tu ondi meti any min ko ondi meti netsu ko ondi maga wach kanji semla ya made wach susu ya magi wach chegi gyula ya drogu yobadi yachi gyata mares.
Which means that the tendency to look for faults in others, to see faults in others, is that which gives rise to a sense of conflict between ourselves and others, to a sense of opposition or taking an adversarial position between ourselves and others. And if we allow that to happen again and again, it means that even hearing the name of another person will give rise to the sense of dislike in your mind, which means that when you look at what this attitude causes your mind, it brings about that sense of disturbance, unhappiness, discomfort that arises in your mind.
These are kanji and mission game tire loti and social nudos, social magiba soya good drogudos. These are dealing on Samalaya, Mugoyaj, Samuel Chagos, Kanzanzo Goya di Devari, Mugoya di Dungari, the D some Dungan Jingianza, Magiba Jingaza, that's how in Mugoach was. Hinaya Nanzugi me and Mila Mishambale, Kyo the Yomar say, Keshavan, Kyon Choros, so Imbaina, Kyon Komchawandi, Mishambale, Kyon Choros. And it can Yoba D and it Kyon Chon, that Gor Gomar Slavana, D and it go Mogo D, Kevin you the May Tolia, Goba you the May Tolia, some Tango Series. Kyon Chon Dena and Sosolea, Kevin Cardo, Goba Cardo. And they were young do Dunga Yungu. These some Tamino and King Choni, 다 물어지 아니 연된 기촌 때바이나 아니 미대야 삼단이로 빼는 사상적이나 아니 찍찍이야 꽤 매워지 사상지 용어 말아서 라 비긴 대자세당 맹인기 사상지 용어 말아서 개지 캐라나야 대자세당 맹인기 사상지 여번은 캐랑 사상 로고 말아서 라 이내야 니기 깽촌 때대바이나 아니 사상 만참을 차버야지 마도 편도 지면도 연된 기촌 때진 통부 지와나 늦에디 기부 차야지 디디레도스 라
To looking for faults in others is what makes a mind unhappy, uncomfortable, unwell. So we want to be happy. We want to develop happiness and well-being, and we want to avoid suffering, state in which we are unwell. But still, when we allow our mind to again and again dwell on the shortcomings of others, the faults of others, and so forth, it does affect our mental happiness and well-being. So then, if you wonder if what we say here is that we shouldn't be looking at the faults of others, does it mean that others do not have faults, that others do not have any shortcomings? Of course, it doesn't mean that. To begin with, when we look at ourselves, we can recognize that just like we are full of faults, also others are likely to be full of faults. And yet, when you think of which attitude would be more helpful for you personally in terms of bringing about a greater degree of mental happiness and well-being, or avoiding some sense of discomfort, we know that we know based upon a personal experience that if you tend to be critical of others all the time and always look for the faults of others, it does affect your mental happiness, your mental comfort. Even insofar when you start small and look at how it affects your personal relationship, right? So we might like to have a personal relationship going on. And when we get into a new relationship, it's not that the person that we're in a relationship with is completely free from faults. Of course, no, we don't. It's very hard to find someone that is completely free from fault. So when we get into a new relationship, the person that we're in a relationship with is likely to have faults. They still have anger, attachment, ignorance, and so forth, still operating to a certain degree in the mind stream. But if in that personal relationship, we always tend to dwell on their negative traits, we always look for the faults in our partner, in the person that we are with in the relationship, it will not last for a long time. We'll not be able to have a good relationship going on. And therefore, it's much better rather than to look for the faults of others, to focus on the faults of others, to remind ourselves that others also have good qualities.
Today's dinner, the Yunding Chon Diadi, kitchen bush, Yunding Chon Diadi, Penang, the Lamrim Nonoya, so the Penata, and a Kabdi, and Sheni Tensu Korea, that near training Yunguras, and it's Givishin Laya, Yunding Chon, and Tagos, Gyungchon, Danyamari, Sonde, Nanga di Tiredos, Givishin some Mayba, Sunajiva in Suzu Chok Homo, Pigi, when it came the Kandaji by Nako, Yunding Chon Tatuana, and it Kibu Yonj, then Chambu Yonj, the Yungudos Ra, the Damnaj Reshas, Ra, Damnaj Reshas.
It's so important to make sure that we do pay attention to the good qualities of others. And we've also encountered that in an earlier stage in the presentation of the states of the path to enlightenment, the Lamrim text. The section of relying upon a spiritual teacher also gives a useful advice about the way that we rely upon a spiritual teacher. And advice is don't look for the faults in that person. Don't focus on the faults of that person. Pay attention to the good qualities of that person. And also Lamrim Kappa says that not only it is valid for the attitude that we develop in relation to the spiritual teacher, but also with our friends, boyfriends, girlfriends, whoever might be that person. Look at the good qualities, focus on good qualities rather than dwelling on their faults. So this is an excellent personal instructions.
아니 생기 용된 gomya jengi yonde le jesu ran kiadi nenga dindijile tukde yonsa ani nembu chen da ji kanji sanji chamden tigi da son chagoras do chagoras pena ani baba sambu chibigi ani do songodas tin sanji khorang son chage nenga dindijile dos ra.
Meditating on the good qualities of others, rejoicing in the good qualities of others is a very powerful advice. It is advice given by the Buddha himself in sutras such as the Sutra of Samantabhadra.
아니 나도 교육 좀 대대와이나 교육 통고레스 가스는 아주 샘 코로나리아 베나 미시 직 에니 피기 응원부 잡대와 나신 미시 응원부 잡치네 까본 통약 탑시 제발 백하고로 왔다 드난신기 따지 수수 생활에 교육지어디 차담모서 교육지어디 아니 가발 때는야 교육지 통디고레스 니치고 삼대와이나 용야메 주지 되니 간 가드이나 만지고지 kawa dena ya mandi wachi yungu yoras chidani kon covid nela ya ko khabji tsemo nanshin yin so da khabji tsemo la ya meji dewa na ane suchin dunga teji ma to bi dewa yonya ji yomaras ra odinanshin ki covid nela ya kaddu na ko ane dewa medi sambala inaya di ane thand lemao ane chi tela ya yondeng chaji samtu waina ane di chani and sosolaya didn't do to get youngers.
And not only that, we obviously see faults in others. We can admit that we do see faults in others, and yet in our mind, we need to remind ourselves that the seeing of faults in others is also influenced by the way that we perceive others, in that we come to see faults in others because our mind also has faults. It's like wearing tinted sunglasses. If you wear sunglasses that have a bluish tint, and you're hoping to see everything having a whitish hue, it's not going to happen. If your sunglasses are blue, this is how you're going to see the world. So then we do see faults in others, but our mind is still controlled or powered by anger, attachment, and so forth. So of course, when we see faults in others, we have to then remind ourselves that we see faults in others from the perspective of a mind that is still controlled by anger, attachment, and so forth. And this is part of our samsaric experience. It is said in some texts that samsara is like dwelling on the tip of a needle. So if you sit on the tip of a needle, of course, it's not going to be comfortable. It's going to give you pain. Right? And this is our experience within samsara. So then when we come across a certain situation and what appears to our mind is faults in the other person, which is something that is making our mind uncomfortable, unhappy, creates problems and so forth, we have to remind ourselves that this is part of the samsaric process. This is also the way that our mind view a certain situation from the perspective of anger, attachment, and the like. And therefore, rather than dwelling on the faults of that person, we can focus, or we can try to focus on the good qualities. And as such, that will give us less problems and less difficulties.
kabu pe pere dos rangan du so te de ban ngan zu chi iwan tho de sa pe na chi so so le me yo pe na dumra ya bo chi yo da yu jong ya bo o din di shu chi bu me do sam ni ani tro song chen bu tan de la dong di yang de la yong me so ani sa je shen ba ji le ya ngam chin tro de do di kha re se na ani pi de ba khang go ma ras sem gu sam lu tang ma shi bi wang di de ba khang ya ji any COVID ni kawalan drone mevadi gacha gan gada barwas ta susu sendi chadam monsun di nyonta anchi susu gi samlu tansha tone deba khanye ji sotu bana kawal dena ya nganzu pebe pele ya phaba phaksa manla ya kibse jores ani nganzu teundu sorbu shujorda koran kibu chenpe ani chuchu 추주 마음 쇼실이야 베디 니에트 거라서라 어 딘디도 간지 먼저 생 내가 가만가 레시스라
Without reducing the power of anger, attachment, and so forth, those afflictive states of mind in our mind stream, wherever we will be, we will still encounter problems and difficulties. We can see how our mind behaves. When we think of something that we do not have, something that our mind sees as very appealing, very beautiful, very desirable, like, for example, thinking of hanging out for the day in a beautiful meadow, in a beautiful garden. When you get to that place, you see that there are people that have that as their everyday reality and still they're dissatisfied. They want to go somewhere else and do something else, which is part of our samsaric experience in which our mind is discontented. Whatever we do, there's always that lingering sense of discontent. So if we are going to be able to reduce our afflictive states of mind, to reduce anger, attachment, and so forth, and develop a sense of contentment, we're going to be able to then live comfortably or stay comfortably wherever we are. Just like there's a Tibetan saying, I think that we also have that in English, we'll be able to live happily and comfortably like a pig rolling in mud.
Digmeva di chik sortu wainero ani pe lelhawu jilaya ani mitsiki wuch tantu yachik ra yungu yo sares.
So we can take it into practice and through that make our life happier.
The dini did that di dini chunkor ko said the di anchegi ani tsoksa ba said tsoksa said di Reta namji shudaya, tangan sok sengindi, so gyun soklaya, and gyun soklaya jargodas. Debu kandraj kigi yobayna, debu digi, and it's 70 down, and it's 70 chingu mayimba, and di yambu, gyuyambu jin sanchini, and it's 70 temi, debu chungu yanza, and nanzu yamning zawa di, and it's lojong bal sangye lo joya chibo mayimba teda nyamdo ani sok sago yanza ani choba puya ani jesu iranchiya ani chatsiya lo soba te tamji ani gyunsola yam jogores ra da re gyunsola yam jogores.
Of the 7 limbs of worship, that was the 4th limb, which is the limb of rejoicing. Next, the 5th limb is called the limb of asking to turn the wheel of Dhamma, which is a limb that we use in order to accumulate the collection. So this is another term that we use in our Buddhist practice, to accumulate the collections, the accumulations. What it means is to accumulate the collection of causes that are required for our attainment of the state of Buddha. Just like if you want to grow a plant or a flower, you have the seed for that. And the seed alone is not able to bring about to develop into a flower or into the plant that you seek. It also needs to come together with certain conditions. So water and fertilizers and warmth and so forth, causes and conditions, a collection of causes and conditions is needed in order to produce the result that you want. Also here, when we think of accumulating the collections, we accumulate a collection of causes that contributes to our attainment of our own state of Buddhahood. So we combine that with collections of causes such as making offerings and making prostrations and rejoicing in the virtues and so forth. All of these are causes that contribute to our own attainment.
Tenda chungkor ko setri chungkor ko kursana ani tachi sikabdushana ani chusoro chi sej sula shuguris nandi nonzu khongya ani kyawil salta shawat ro kyawil ki tachi zodi ani ranaya landur ni shinji maloba tengingi ani lamadi ta ani kyapsum dani dichagayos and dindiji leya tension telaya and nga chu shero cheese ra ta ditembi gobadi lama tembi goba tiya ani lama la teni sanji ki chuni ani chudi ani lale la tarcheni ani ran sanji sala yo rogo ya chi o dindi chagwa tinza che nyembala ya che nyembala ya ani sosu toni che soro chi slavchini ya sota gores tinza chungo ko se diris.
This limb is called the limb of requesting to turn the wheel of Dhamma. What we are asking here is to be taught unerringly what we need to do, what we need to take up and what we need to cast aside in order to progress along the stages that will result in our own state of Buddhahood. We ask, please teach me to do that. Please teach me unerringly. It depends upon relying upon the Lama. We get instructions, we put them into practice, and it depends upon that we can attain the state of Buddhahood. So in order to listen to teachings, first of all, we need to request them. This is what we do in the fifth limb, which is turning the wheel of Dhamma, a request to turn the wheel of Dhamma, sorry.
Dinza karchini ya ani so tabgores lawandi ani so madamni chedam ani chu shero chise ani so madaba chu she di chedam chane runguyo mares chela ya makubundrigi ani makubigi ani chojele ya zigyoris chojin tiris nini ji kon namig toni ani bezum mebi toni chöjing nyembayina di nyembi kawla ya chi shudra mayu ya ta ani nyen sawi jela ya chi lane na tar matu ya soba tindi mambu yungu asares ani sosu gi pigla ya ani lunga yisung ton bezun chin chu shubayina ani penata chi gyundro son ta ya soba re ani tuzu ta ya re ani chi pigla ya so ta tindi chi ton chu shubayina ani chu kan nyemba di and chusos mandro lalen tar tuyaleya keba yungu giresro.
It is said that without being requested, it is not suitable to teach the Dhamma. So such requests need to be made. So requests need to be made, you could say, because there are different issues or different reasons for making such requests. To begin with, it is not the right way for teachings to be given if they're given to someone that has a disrespectful attitude. So therefore, if you make a request to be taught the Dhamma, then we avoid that hurdle of being taught to someone that has a disrespectful attitude. So that's one reason. Another reason is that if you become a bit dismissive or not paying attention to the Dhamma, you take it too light-heartedly, it is likely that even if the Dhamma is going to be taught to you, you're not going to use it in order to assess your own mind, to check whether your mind has faults, and to put the Dhamma into practice in order to eliminate the faults from your own mind. So then making requests for the Dhamma to be taught to you means that from your side, you're not becoming inattentive or dismissive or the sense of ignoring the Dhamma, but you want to take it up so that you want to listen to teachings so that you'll be able to put them into practice. But also, if you make such requests, it means that from your side, you're willing to allocate some time to use whatever resources you have, whatever you need to do in order to get those teachings so that you will put them into practice, which means that altogether you're making your attitude and your approach to listen to teachings, you're making it act in a way that will work for you in your spiritual practice.
And the Tolaya Drosun Tantungina and Teletembiga and church in the Yodebach. Rangazuka Gashilaya and Ringashi Pigi remain Roji Yimbaina and Nyangandro. Gomungas choose Pigi Shende Trenkoya, Pugoya, Dindoji Baina, and Gomunga Chuselia, Senna Dichin, Chuning Amandre, and the Yunguras. The Tindi Kansa Digi and Che 냠네 제투세디 카부슈 차고레스 라 아니 지 벤주 용시 질이야 안 때치니 아니 최디 자치무 젠투 메바디 세우 차고라스 라
So then, when you allocate time and resources and so forth to attend teachings, it means that you're using this opportunity in a way that does not go to waste. You're making sure that you're not wasting your time. So it's about developing a sense of appreciation to the Dhamma. It is possible when we look at our own attitude with respect to such issues, we might see that there's certain situations or certain events where people prefer just to go to free events. If teachings are given completely for free, and teachings are given in that way often, so people go. Sometimes if they ask to contribute to something, $5, $10, they find it really difficult and then they decide not to go. So then looking at our own attitude, if we find that there is a certain Dhamma teaching that require some allocation, either of money, time, and so forth, then we are incapable of doing that. It is indicative to us that in our mind, we don't have a great appreciation of the Dhamma in the sense that it doesn't appear to us yet to be precious enough to our mind.
안 뒤즈 땅퉁이 아니 칼레갑퉁이 딘디지 만달레 고도스 추닝이 임바이느야 안직 소수 무슬르 땅이 아니 추르야 아니 조투야 아니 라마 게위신이 텐투야 딘디지 고도스 카이스나 만두타지 비게 춘종 그름발야 지금 제바이나 홍 깨우 담부수 남탈 제바이나 아니 세직 루치래야 제비 공방이 되니 깨우 강여버디 랑이 릉아 이섬 랑이 쳔디기 되기 르다니 아니 최체발야 로딩이 짱짱 지마도베게 안 디지 르담 무퉁이지 아니 최냠는 세된 총자와 제메바스라.
And the same can be also said with respect to the teacher. A teacher leading a student along the steps of the path to enlightenment, they need also to relinquish any sense of self-interest and to guide a student, to teach a student in a way that is suited for their spiritual progress. So then when we think about our wish to put the Dhamma into practice, to train in the ways of the Dhamma, and also to think of that something that needs to be done or that I want it to be done for the rest of my life, then we need to then make sure that we do give it enough time, allocate whatever we need in order to rely upon a spiritual teacher, get instruction, put him into practice, so that would be a whole life process of progressing towards the state of enlightenment. And there are those that are capable of doing it in one life based upon one body. At least when you look at accounts or biographies of excellent masters of the past, you do find that there were some individuals that were able to attain a state of complete enlightenment in one lifetime based upon one body. But when you look at those accounts, you get the impression, you come to see that what they did is that basically they dedicated the whole life for their pursuit after the state of enlightenment, which means that it wasn't something that was done half-heartedly. That was for them what they have allocated their life for, relying upon a spiritual teacher, getting instructions, and then putting them into practice for the rest of their life.
There is the Jesu Chaman Gombugi, Chuki tend to soak once, Chuki tend to soak once, Chona, Dindich Gogores, that Dindich Machoma in a ya, Manzuchi, Sin digging, Jigdingi Chashalaya, this chick, Loton Chetunich, and dig Lotoni, and Cholaya, and Drotunich, never to go thus. Jigdin Zanin Lotan Mutuniji by now, and Church Yadi, Zamshaya Redos, 아니 지된다 취니 몇 로가래도스라 아니 쳔디기 지 아니 또그 담선 아니 지 딘리치 테스트 담 통해 지기 아니 취체세디 카부페레샤스라 카부페레샤스
Maitreya said in one of his texts, he referred to even giving up one's own life for the sake of the Dhamma. So if you can do that, even at the cost of your life, for the sake of the Dhamma, that's what Maitreya was referring to. But then we will look at how do we start. Of course, it is likely that we haven't reached that stage in which we would even be giving up our own life for the sake of the Dhamma. So we begin with at least reducing some of our involvement with worldly affairs so that we can allocate some time for our training in the Dhamma. We need to at least to be willing to give up some engagement with worldly affairs. If we cannot give any of our involvement with worldly affairs, if we cannot give it up, then there's not much that we would be able to accomplish. There's not much Dhamma training that would be able to undergo if there is no willingness whatsoever to give up some engagement with worldly affairs, because the ways of the Dhamma and the ways of the world are different.
le tang gwen ji chago maros tenen jigde le tang ni kyong da ke ni som dang wa na tang ke se de ngaz le de ji yung yo na ke re dunga yung yo na kyong ros ra tang ngoma di ji di jigde le tang ne che le ya cho tu wa na ani pi ta ji lu sem ni na ni ani sem gi de ji di che cho ne ra ge yo ba di ya cha ja ta ma ta an ro san ji chang so thang me ba ji che ko na mi cham lo ani chi ani 가서 다지 직작 통 아니 디송 요라스 디 딘디치 간절에 양고거 땅고 양 이수 책 말았어 단 직된 초래야 직된 르 마탄 직된 코랑 토래야 송디 아니 지 차담 몬소 만트야 텔템비 동가 만트야지 마도 메와인자 아니 직된 르 땅고도 세디 템무비 네초래야 소소래야 피기기 동가 종사기 시지 차관자 le tangu dus son mata di ngone gi kepsan ji yobati kebe ngone gi tendan bi kebe yobaji le tangu dus son jaba tin ri zaw ni remedos.
And when we speak about the willingness to give up some worldly affairs in order to practice the Dhamma, we don't mean to adopt a mental attitude that feels that this is a true sacrifice, as if we are now losing something, we have to lose something in order to practice the Dhamma. If we think that for us this is a sacrifice, so to speak, it means that we are not giving up worldly affairs. When you give up worldly affairs for the sake of the Dhamma, it means that you look at what the Dhamma gives you and what worldly affairs give you in terms of developing happiness and well-being or avoiding suffering. So to give up worldly affairs or some worldly affairs for the sake of Dhamma practice, it means that your goal is to develop a greater degree of mental well-being, happiness and well-being. So if you give up worldly affairs for the sake of the Dhamma, it means that you went through a process by which you assessed and analyzed which will give you more profit, which would be more beneficial in terms of developing long-term happiness and well-being. Is it that worldly affairs are going to give you happiness and well-being long-term? Or is it that developing your mind in a way that occurs with the Dhamma will give you more happiness and well-being? So when you then make that assessment and say that for me personally, it would be more profitable to spend time practicing the Dhamma, and from that sake, I will relinquish some of my involvement with worldly affairs, that would mean giving up worldly affairs for the sake of the Dhamma. So you don't see that as a sacrifice. You see that as something that for you will be profitable. And this is also something that countless Buddhas and Bodhisattvas of the past, those that have already gone to their states, have unanimously said. And there's no deception in that statement. So if we find that we cannot give it up, if we cannot give up our involvement or some involvement with worldly affairs, it means that we're still willing to indulge in affairs that are still associated with anger, attachment, and so forth, which means that rather than working towards reducing them, we're still getting involved willingly in states that increase them, that develop them. And therefore, there's no way that we'd be able to develop long-term happiness and well-being if we're still willingly take up those states which are involved with anger, attachment, and the like.
Bena bendo chunju shabaina bendo chunju shabaina ra ani jigdin thend ni mizike bata jigdin thend mani ni mizike da ni le bendo shabaina bena nado jimana ra jigdin ki chani gyupenju re lomba re ani khachan re ra thamushina khaya meju chik inaya ji pamare pobo momo garden tene chunjung koni kya ani ji rab chon chöchi goresin labje tindi ji woni sozo imbaina ji it's ji jani muziki bi tamadele ya an dandi chala ngarzo jigdeng chan siaban kyan ji seta chuo yorde ne ya sem kiblu do the peshi ni sem kibayu jiris ra and dinan danda ji ruru chen and kyanzu ngal dus nyaya di zawadi ngachunjo kon ta jigden pige ji penjo do tangi and riglam joros tindile zawni ni malawachi and chö khoran jamal den somenza dandi chalaya ji and sozo pakpebu and malayina ji and sangi chö tsu ji lenki raya kogobdia tindichil den chombaras 어떤 직된 경제 좀 줘봐요. 나 그냥 나신진 대야를 모두 니지 고급지라 해매 왔어요.
So then in terms of not seeking affairs of the world, but seeking to develop your mind in a way that accords with the Dhamma, Geshe said that at least he can speak about it from his own personal background. So Geshe was born in Tibet into a family of nomads in a place or area that was not materialistically progressive. He came from a poor background. And from young age, his parents and also his grandparents have planted seeds in his mind that one day he will become a monk, right? So the seeds were planted in his mind from very, very young age. So indeed, he became a monk, and he spent most of his life in studying and investigating the ways of the Dhamma rather than learning how to develop worldly affairs. So then in hindsight, when he looks at his current state of mind, he feels that for him it was a good way to progress or to live his life. He finds that his mind is quite relaxed, open, and spacious, particularly in having lived here for a few years and having come across quite a few people, and having some discussions and dialogues with people. Geshe has that feeling that in terms of being able to maintain an open and spacious and relaxed state of mind, for him, it worked well in comparison with others. So then Geshe says that entertaining some thoughts about how would it have been differently. Suppose that he would have grown up in being taught how to focus on worldly affairs, making money, how the world works in terms of finance and so forth. Probably he would have no basis or common basis with us here in discussing the way to develop one's mind in a way that accords with the Dhamma, questions and answers and so forth. So obviously for Geshe, things have worked differently, and he feels that in the great scheme of things, seeking mental development through the Dhamma rather than worldly affairs for him worked better.
Kamyon Dron Dige, Joson Sama, and Benanga Europe Namaya, Fish Jacob Shiz in the China, Dawani Dron di Joson Chia Tango Mandasra, the D and Shambakaya Maros, and in church and Tawach and touches can do you guarding Tilden and Mitsu, Gazin Trosing on the Chingos. 단디 차랑이 지 아니 trouble 예수도스 양아치 고고도스 라바나 태선 메고 콘정한테 찌그레스 이 하고도스 이내 양아를 고에스기 문도스더라 아니 키우신 때 간지 먼저 키우신 대초야로지 사와디 아니 최치 가든이 삼아주는 나디 셴바치 나치 인상성지 자원인 메스라 자원인 메스디.
So then Geshe said that for him personally it worked well, particularly when you look at that from the viewpoint of living in Tibetan society. So he's been here for 6 years. Now, within the 6 years that he's been here, he managed to, at one point in time, he traveled to Europe, stayed a couple of months with different friends, traveled to 3 or 4 countries within Europe. Then, he visited India a few times, having conversation with his friends back in India. And coming from this background, he didn't have to pay for almost anything. He paid almost for nothing. In that, his friends, his acquaintances had that appreciation of someone wearing the robes, having someone that has studied, have been practicing for quite a few years in this life. And Geshe is quite sure that even now, if he asks his friends to help him out with certain things, he is quite sure that people would be happy to provide him with whatever he asks. But having said that, it's not that he has something to ask. He's quite happy with what we have here. But the point that what you have now, but the point that Geshe is wanting to make is that looking at training in the Dhamma, studying the Dhamma, practicing the Dhamma, developing long-term happiness and well-being, Geshe is confident based upon his experience that this is the way to go. Rather than trying to achieve that through focusing on worldly affairs, the way to achieve long-term happiness and well-being is through that way.
피 산지 리요로스라 진짜 지den을 땅바이나 아니 지den기 추 아니 지den기 롱저레 지den기 메레 아니 지den을 땅바이나 지den 추 코리오나지 저러지 라 다디 직진에 계속 막고 drone 하면서 간지 드리러 나 드리러 통고도스라 쉬워지게 비게래 착신지 아니 짜친 제대바이나 디 아니 뇨다 차대야로지.
Having said that, Geshe is not claiming that he's able to relinquish everything without exception, all worldly affairs. There are different ways of doing that, different levels, different degrees of doing that. There is one account of a famous Tibetan yogi called Milarepa, who has completely given up all worldly affairs and had managed to progress greatly in his spiritual path. And Geshe says that personally is incapable of doing it in a way that Milarepa did. Currently is not at the level of being able to do it just like Milarepa. And yet he's confident that if you completely give up the world, it's like, it's almost like you could say an interaction with another person. You give them up and then they come back to you. So if Geshe said that if he gives up the world will come back to him. So it is possible to do it. And if we're not going to be capable of relinquishing, giving up some worldly affairs, if we still stay entrenched with attachment, desire, and so forth, we will still continue to experience problems and suffering.
And Toba maybe Kambani Rindu Manova Namla, Lujan Tini to Trini, Churtam Kuman Devos.
So in the 5th branch, the 5th limb of requesting to turn the will of Dhamma, looking at Samantrabhadra's King of Prayer, it says, "You are the bright lights of worlds in 10 directions, who have attained Buddha's omniscience through the stairs of awakening. All you are my guides, please turn the supreme will of Dhamma." This is the verse from Samantrabhadra's King of Prayer. And then to that, Lamrim Tsongkhapa says, requesting to turn the wheel of Dhamma is set forth in that single stanza, the one that we've just read. Emanating the same number of bodies, you should exalt those who have awoken to complete Buddhahood in the fields of the 10 directions, who have not long ago found unimpeded and unobstructed exalted knowledge to teach the Dhamma.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. So we'll say some.
When Geshe talk about the rejoicing and Geshe talk about practicing contents, and that's where contents.
Yeah.
In contents, that's where you have the analogy as Western world, the pig mouth.
Yeah.
Yes. My question is, why when Sakyamuni Buddha, when he decided to let others, he gets such a great achievement? And why when I try to renunciate from some suffering, why I don't have this kind of direction of achievement?
Dila Geshe rangi yenla tola ke shedurwa ane doba chungwa chokshi cha di tola chokshi cha tola ke chik soi ba ane tamla kiran phagba dhambal chokpa la nyebe nan chin den da chik soi ba de tola sang tang wa inarwa Quran tan sangi shage to patuwa ina shage to ba Sangi shaka tuba, sangi ko pa matoko na ani poran tsama le tane, metsan penjo longchu tsama le tane, ani sangi ko pa nyamana droba chenpo chik to warwa. Koran dende je tuki ma resa. Chik tapsi je wayna kangen chiki resa. Tadi Koran tan sangi shaka tuba ki keba di kare imi ko je tuba Quran jeme tuba karinas Quran san karin
Sanji Jamden dietni le tani kanga teores. Lo tugrin ya ji and shela zani ma shun shun kanga teores. Ina kanga doni chiaki logo yoros. Tanganzu yi le tan ma tu ya di kanga ji tenanga kanga ji chegri samcheni ro. Logo de medi ani nganzu doni chi tu yo marmato shemba chi pares sanji chamne di kuzutia shatal tribi lujire ani nganzu lutia shatal tribi lujire keba khan yo mares inaya lotab de mewanza nganzu le di logo de mewanza nge le tanjana nga kangan tigiri penanga khala maran lagari samsam rochi tirwasta.
Well, first off, when the Buddha decided to leave the royal palace and go out and seek his own stage of attainment, he actually had gone through a lot of difficulties and problems. It's not that the Buddha was free from problems when he started following that path. When you look at, for example, the accounts of the 6 years of ascetic practices that the Buddha went through before becoming Buddha, then you get a sense that it wasn't hard at all, actually. The Buddha did experience difficulties. Sorry, it wasn't easy at all. The Buddha still experienced difficulties, but the Buddha faced them with a sense of courage, with an undaunting commitment to attain his own level of attainment. But often we lack that sense of courage, in that when you think of the 6 years of ascetic practices that the Buddha went through, they were involved with, for example, reducing the amount of food and so forth, even if the Buddha had that attitude that even if comes at the cost of not getting a meal or not getting food for a certain duration, he would still do it. But then when we look at our commitment to a practice, do we have the same level of courage or commitment in a practice? We often when we think that I want to put a lot of time or effort into my practice, but if we think of the problems or the difficulties that we might experience, we become a bit faint-hearted. If we think that, for example, it might be that I'll have to miss a meal, I will have less food and so forth, it brings that unsettling state of mind. We think that it's going to be too difficult. Will I be able to do that, and so forth? Which means that the type of courage, the type of commitment that we bring into the practice is not to the same degree as the Buddha.
Re sanjamden dile di lot of the kandajin ni wares lawandi karswa tachi se de chima chamagi nechu sik to bal teni logo di ni yasa sangudo sra kasna nganchu se dile ya kala pina ani chi kala kangan tere chi dolo ni ji ko khoya mara ya sobare ani chi kamba desa mara di chita kanga re de yin ya ani chi munta meba ani ngansong de kin dunga nyong ya la ya de ba ina di chinjung shujir was sanji chom den di ani chi pi kawa munta meba dunga nyong ya theda se de la ya chi togu tamsang la chong ta yin di yacha jan yatam se de la ya togu tamsang la chong ta ya di ani keben che yobati sing to ba inza lot of the Nigores. Nanzu, Kiawachimi Nitsu, some of our dancing mebanza, Kiawachima Tandi Chelayachi, Chadan Shuji Tony, Drocheni, Kalach Raba inaya, Kiawachima Dunga Karinyogu Yovadi, Nanzu Sam the talk or mebanza, and send it on 2 Yomaras.
And if you wonder, in what way did the Buddha develop that great sense of courage and bravery in approaching a spiritual practice? Well, Geshe reckons that it happened through considering well what will occur to him in future lifetimes, being able to have a vast perspective of the past and future lifetimes, but particularly future lifetimes to come, in which there is the prospect of, for example, of ending up in a miserable state of existence, like the hells, and experiencing states of suffering that are beyond any depth and breadth. The Buddha developed that commitment or courage in his practice when he considered that relinquishing those worldly affairs in that life is still much easier than ending up in future lifetimes in miserable states of existence. And it is a valid point. When we think of the different states of life, the different states of birth that we take in different stages of our samsaric existence, we go between different states of existence. And when we end up in miserable states of existence, the suffering is terrible, it's great. So then relinquishing things that belong to this life, seeing faults in attachment to gain and respect, social interactions, and so forth, seeing faults in being attached to that. And also thinking that even if I'm gonna get less food in this life, even if my clothes are not going to be that nice and shiny, even if I'm not going to have all those resources, house and so forth, that are nice, it's still, in some sense, much better than what I will get in future lifetimes if I end up in a miserable state of existence, such as the hells. So being able to compare other states of existence to his life before becoming enlightenment, the Buddha was able to develop the great courage and determination in his practice. But when we then approach a spiritual practice, do we think about it like that? Do we think mainly of what will occur to us in this life? Or do we think mainly of what is awaiting for us in future lifetime? Geshe reckons that we might give some consideration to future lifetimes, still often we don't do that, and often we become focused on what we can get from the Dhamma in this life. And if we then think of what we can get in general only in this life, we find it difficult to give up food, clothing, social interactions, and so forth, and therefore our commitment or our approach to the practice is not as committed or not as determined as the Buddha had.
ra lula ya kadu chebadi chue chebal ten lula kadu chebadi samla gawa gome gilya draw yours nanzu chue chedu and lula kadu yonya tilia toxun chini chue pangsha joras bed logarada sometimes bed logarada samdra.
There are so many things that can be said with respect to that. One of them is, for example, that if you practice perfect Dhamma, a perfect Dhamma practice would mean that even if physically you're experiencing difficulties, some austerities, mentally, your joy increases and develops. So we can then assess a practice. If we put something into practice and physically we find it difficult, often we give it up. Right? We think that that's too hard. I cannot bear with that physical difficulty. So that is indication that we know that we haven't been able to use a practice in order to develop a greater degree of mental happiness. And therefore, it is still not, if we behave in that way, we're still not at a stage in which our practice of Dhamma is pure.
Tandabardo Sanji Jigden Pevin Chonyo Mares, Tandayina, one the Tani, Samba Namdaki, Chu rank and Tolaya, Rotuana, and it could me within Jim by that, Kani in a Tavish Nidogres, the Chetangin Dungar said, Dingan Lukora, Sajin Yavali Pombo, Dugden Banza, Titola Dungaji, Kajusi Pilayaji, Benjo Droina. Little Dunga Mayanji, Chemados, Yomaristra, that some ya wish you language, jump shoe chewage redasra, the Dishagindara.
And also when you look at the history of Buddhist practitioners, Geshe reckons that you will not find even a single example of someone that has died of starvation, having given up food for the sake of the Dhamma. So even if someone did give up some involvement with worldly affairs, no one died of starvation and the like. Also, if you think of giving up certain things, still as human beings, we do have ways of getting by. We will find something that will still keep us going as human beings, even if we decide to give certain things up. And in doing that, we still take into consideration that this body that we have is what we call a body of suffering. The nature of the body is the nature of suffering. We call it the contaminated, appropriated aggregate. So it doesn't matter what we provide the body with. It's still in the nature of suffering. So therefore, there will still be problems and suffering for us. Even if you try to care for the body, to pamper it and so forth, it will still go through different types of suffering. So when you then approach your Dhamma practice with those points for thought, the ones that Geshe is introduced, and you can think well of the difficulties and problems that you might encounter in your practice, and you can become smart about it.
Thank you.
All right. Let's dedicate the virtue that we've created together. Chanchus, Make Pana Kegyochi, Keva Nyampa Mepayam, Gone Kundu Kavarasho, Nyududa Lama Sangye Rukune, Joa Chikyamalupa, Jai Salanguparasho. Awe Kowe Shinkanju, Pendande Wa Malu Jungwe, Chenre Siwa Tenzin Gyatsoi, Shape Site Padu Tengyo Chi. Janshin Jangun Gyawe, Tenzin Kyong Lewe Konso Lokoze, Chosun Kowe Le Mondu. Pala Sodru Shingundu Shabden Shu.
Next week, Channel 7 will be coming to Shimmer's Institute. what's going on here. They would like to come into the Gompa on Friday morning to video everyone who comes for teaching. If anyone is not comfortable with being filmed, please just come and sit in the lounge. But just so I'll let you know.
Dress up.
Yes.
Dress up, have a good hairdo.
Can I just make another announcement? Geshe's still here, but I'm sure maybe Geshe hasn't heard. 7th of November, FPMT Australia, first time ever, we think, is sponsoring long life puja for all our Geshes in Australia.
They can find.
So I think it's on Facebook. They're requesting if people want to contribute to that. It will be done.
Australia
We're going to have to make it happen, right?
됨달라
It's
니
already in
고방고마다
process.
텐션 되는 피어레 텐션 피어레스는 콘솔데 세림보는 도치 샵텐치 제레스
But maybe we can. We'll just
Australia
do
Geshe.
something together.
믹스 오스트레일리아 계시던 세던 논란지 못한 거야.
Australia 개규라든지 지금 봐라
7th so it's a Monday.
네 그래서 진짜 지지자들 축사
Chigila, just Geshe or with the translator?
No, just
we're always being discriminated against